All right. Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we are diving into the case of Mariusz Trynkiewicz.
Ah, yes. The Satan of Piotrków, as the media dubbed him.
That's the one. We've got 2 YouTube videos on him, both in Polish though, and they seem to cover like his whole life, his crimes, all of it. And well, let me tell you, it's a complex one.
Oh, I bet. Cases like this, they really make you wonder about the nature of evil, you know? Like, was he born that way? Or did something happen to him? Did something make him that way?
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to figure out today. I mean, we're not just talking about Trynkiewicz himself, but also like how the justice system handled everything. And let me tell you, that's a whole other can of worms from what I've seen.
Oh, absolutely. Some missed opportunities there for sure. Maybe some questionable decisions along the way, you know?
So let's start at the beginning. Trynkiewicz, he was born in 1962, an only child, raised by, seemingly loving parents, maybe a little overprotective if you believe the sources. They lived in Piotrków Trybunalski.
Yeah.
On the surface, pretty average, right?
Right. But sometimes those normal childhoods, they have things going on underneath, things we don't see. Like, take the overprotective parents, for example. It sounds harmless enough, but there's research out there, studies that have shown that it can sometimes lead to problems with like social isolation and difficulty developing coping mechanisms. The kid never really learns to deal with things on their own, and that can be a recipe for trouble later on.
Interesting. So even though he's a bright kid, even won some academic awards, according to the sources, Trynkiewicz, he was kind of a loner, preferred to be by himself, struggled connecting with others, that sort of thing. Oh, and there's also mention of sleepwalking episodes during his childhood.
Sleepwalking. Now, those episodes, they might seem totally unrelated, but they could point to some underlying psychological issues. I mean, sleepwalking in itself isn't necessarily a big red flag or anything, but it can, sometimes be associated with other things like anxiety, even trauma in some cases.
Do you think that's something that should have been looked into more, like investigated further, or at least noted as something to keep an eye on?
Hard to say for sure without knowing all the details, but looking back, it does seem like those early signs, they were maybe overlooked or dismissed as, I don't know, just some quirks. And it's not unusual for these kinds of things to be missed, especially when there's no obvious pattern of really concerning behavior yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. And this pattern of being a loner, it seemed to stick with him as he got older.
Yeah.
Apparently had a crush on a girl in elementary school, but never even tried to talk to her.
Yeah.
Super self-conscious, according to the videos. Then in high school, his grades completely tanked. Like he just shut down.
Yeah. That kind of withdrawal from school and textual situations, that could be a sign of some deeper emotional stuff going on. Adolescence is already a tough time, for anyone. And for someone who's already struggling with feeling isolated, it can be even harder to deal with. It's possible that without the right kind of support, those feelings of, I don't know, inadequacy, maybe frustration, they just kept growing,
Yeah.
pushing him further and further into himself.
It's like a snowball effect almost. And things didn't seem to get much better when he went to technical school. His grades improved, but the social isolation thing, that stayed the same. He couldn't seem to connect with people his own age.
That ongoing isolation, that's a key point here, Think about it. When we interact with others, with our peers, we learn things, social cues, boundaries, empathy. They're essential skills for healthy development, for understanding how our actions affect other people. And without them, well, it can lead to a pretty skewed perception of the world, a lack of awareness of the consequences of what you do.
You're saying those skewed perceptions, they could potentially lead to criminal behavior.
Well, it's not a direct cause and effect thing, of course, but the research is there. Social isolation is a significant risk factor for all sorts of behavioral problems, aggression, criminal activity, you name it. It can create these feelings of resentment, alienation, and a lack of empathy, which can make it more likely that someone will engage in harmful behaviors.
So we've got this young man struggling socially, emotionally withdrawn, keeping to himself. And then after he graduates college, he gets a job as an elementary school teacher.
Which, knowing what we know now, is incredibly disturbing. But remember, this was Poland in the 1980s. The sources don't really go into detail about how background checks worked back then, but it does make you wonder how someone with these tendencies could could end up in a position of authority over young children.
Right, and this is where things start to take that really dark turn we mentioned earlier. It's during his time as a teacher that Trynkiewicz starts acting on those disturbing impulses.
And it's not just his actions that are disturbing, but also the initial response or lack of a proper response from the justice system.
Yeah, the sources describe his first documented attacks happening while he was on leave from mandatory military service. He assaults two 13-year-old boys. And get this, the court gave him a suspended sentence. He didn't even serve any jail time.
Suspended sentence. It's unbelievable, especially considering that the psychological evaluations at the time, they labeled him as a psychopath with, and I'm quoting here, homosexual urges. Obviously, that kind of language is problematic. It reflects the limited understanding of sexual orientation and mental health back then. But even with their flawed assessment, they recognize he was a danger.
It's just mind-boggling. Knowing he was a threat to children, how could they let him off so easily?
Well, it's easy to judge looking back, knowing what happened later. But we have to consider the context of Poland in the 1980s. Awareness and understanding of pedophilia as a serious problem, it just wasn't what it is today. The justice system, they might not have had the tools or the knowledge to handle these cases effectively.
It's a scary reminder that even when there are clear warning signs, sometimes the system it fails to protect the vulnerable. And in this case, that failure, it would have devastating consequences.
And that brings us to the summer of '88, the summer that really changed everything for Piotrków Trybunalski. I mean, it left a permanent scar, you know?
This is when those devastating consequences you were talking about really kick in, right? We're talking about the Piotrków murders, a whole string of just awful, horrific crimes that really shook Poland, the whole country. The sources, they did do a good job of painting this picture of just pure fear that gripped the town. I mean, 4 boys, they just vanish one after the other over just a few weeks. Imagine that, the tension, the suspicion, the constant worry. Parents, I bet they were terrified to even let their kids out of their sight. Everyone was a suspect.
It must have been just absolutely agonizing for the families, for the entire community. And get this was all happening while Trynkiewicz was out on furlough from prison. They let him out to care for his supposedly sick mother.
Wait, hold on a sec. He was already in prison for the assaults?
Yeah.
And they let him out?
Yeah. Remember those assaults from when he was on leave from the military? Well, he eventually got a sentence, 1.5 years, but even then the system it didn't seem to get how serious his crimes were, you know? And what's even more disturbing is that later on his mother said she was perfectly fine, she didn't need his help at all. It makes you question the whole decision-making process that let him back out on the streets.
It's unbelievable, really. So he's out on furlough, and if I'm following the videos correctly, he goes right back to his old pattern of luring young boys to his apartment. But this time, things escalate big time.
Yeah, that's right. The first victim, he was a 13-year-old boy, Wojciech Prychek. He disappeared on July 4th. And Trynkiewicz, he later confessed that he knew he was going to kill Wojciech when he invited him over.
He strangled the boy, wrapped his body in a blanket, and then later that night drove out to a forest nearby to get rid of the body. He used his father's car, by the way. It's chilling how calculated it all was.
Oh, absolutely. It's a cold-blooded act that it shows a total disregard for human life. You know, it's like he's completely detached from reality. But it gets worse. Trynkiewicz, he sends Wojciech's mother a postcard, supposedly from Wojciech himself, saying he's safe and sound and will be back soon. He even sends a ransom note, demands 50,000 zloty.
He was toying with them, wasn't he? With the authorities, with the grieving family, trying to buy himself time and throw the investigation off track.
Exactly. He was creating this false narrative, manipulating the whole situation to his advantage. It's a glimpse into the mind of a criminal, you know, the length they'll go to avoid getting caught.
And tragically, it worked, at least for a little while. 3 weeks later, he murders 3 more boys. This time, he lures them to his apartment with promises of joining a shooting club.
Right. 11-year-old Tomasz Uriak, 12-year-old Artur Kaczewski, and another 12-year-old Krzysztof Kasmarek. He stabs them, all 3 of them, to death, wraps their bodies up, and then keeps them in his basement for days.
It's unimaginable. I mean, those poor families clinging to hope while this monster, he's just carrying on with his life. He even visits his parents, acts like everything's normal. The sources say he didn't show any remorse, no guilt, nothing.
The level of compartmentalization, it's staggering. It's like he's completely disconnected from the emotional impact of his actions. A total lack of empathy.
Eventually, he drives the bodies to the same forest where he left Wojciech's body and sets them on fire.
Hmm.
A man walking through the forest the next day, he sees the smoldering remains and alerts the police. And that's when the true horror of Trynkiewicz's crimes, it finally starts to come to light.
The whole town was in shock. Thousands of people, they attended the funerals for the boys. The pressure on the police to find the killer, it was immense. They followed all sorts of leads, some more credible than others. There were rumors about a man with an axe seen with the boys, a mysterious car spotted near the lake where they were last seen. Remember, this was before DNA evidence was widely used, before sophisticated forensic techniques.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate how much harder investigations were back then. They were relying a lot on eyewitness accounts, traditional detective work, which, well, it could be unreliable and time-consuming.
Oh, absolutely. And all this time, Trynkiewicz, he's still free. He even attends court hearings to extend his furlough while the police are chasing down these dead ends. It's a stark reminder of how systemic failures can lead to such tragic consequences.
It's like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion.
Yeah.
Thankfully, one of the police officers, he finally puts the pieces together. He finds out about Trynkiewicz's previous convictions for child molestation and brings it to the attention of the prosecutor.
And that was the turning point, really. They search Trynkiewicz's apartment and find bloodstains everywhere. They also find the missing curtain that was used to wrap one of the bodies. The evidence was overwhelming.
Trynkiewicz is arrested, and the town, they finally have some sense of closure, but that closure, it's quickly replaced by outrage. People wanted justice. Real justice. They wanted Trynkiewicz to pay the ultimate price.
The public outcry, it's understandable. It's a natural human reaction to such unspeakable cruelty. But it's also important to remember that everyone deserves a fair trial, due process, even when they've committed the most horrific crimes.
Of course, of course. Everyone deserves a fair trial. So the trial, it begins in September of 1989, and it's a media circus. The courtroom, it's packed. People they're demanding his execution.
The testimonies during the trial, they were just heartbreaking. The boys' mothers, they're forced to recount those agonizing weeks of not knowing, the pain of identifying their son's charred remains. It's difficult to even fathom the depth of their suffering.
And Trynkiewicz, how did he behave during the trial?
Well, according to the sources, he was calm, collected, almost detached, He claimed he didn't remember the details of the crimes, which, from a psychological perspective, could be a way of distancing himself from those horrific acts he committed.
A classic defense mechanism, I guess.
Right.
Trying to minimize his responsibility.
Right. But the evidence, it was just too strong. The court found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death. It seemed like justice had finally been served.
So that's it, right? The end of the story.
Well, not quite. There's another twist, and it's a big one.
Okay.
Yeah, so Trynkiewicz, he gets the death sentence right. But a few months later, in December of '89, Poland's parliament, they declare an amnesty.
Oh, wow.
They commuted all death sentences to 25 years in prison.
So the Satan of Piotrków, as the media called him, he was potentially going to walk free in 25 years.
Yeah.
How did people react to that?
Oh, there were a lot of emotions, anger, fear, disbelief, you name it. A lot of people felt like the justice system had totally failed them, not just once either.
Right. First with the light sentencing for his earlier crimes, and then this.
Exactly. It really shook people's trust in the system. Could the system actually protect them? And as the years went by and Trynkiewicz's release date got closer and closer, that anxiety it just kept growing.
It's understandable for sure. So while he was serving his time, what was life like for Trynkiewicz in prison? Did the sources mention anything about that?
Yeah, they said he was kept in isolation mostly for his own safety. He spent his time reading painting, and supposedly he was getting therapy.
Did they say if the therapy had any effect, any signs that he was, being rehabilitated?
It's hard to say. The sources, they don't really give a clear answer on that, but the psychologists who evaluated him, they noted that he was still interested in child pornography, which is obviously a huge red flag.
It makes you think that maybe those urges, they never really went away even after years in prison and therapy. That's a scary thought.
It really highlights the challenges of treating people with these kinds of deeply ingrained deviant behaviors. It raises questions about whether traditional therapy even works in these cases.
So as 2014 approached the year he was supposed to be released, Poland had a real problem on their hands. What to do with a man who, even though he served his time, was still considered a danger to the public.
Right. It was this huge dilemma, public safety versus individual rights.
Exactly, and they came up with a controversial solution. They passed a law called the Bestiality Act. It allowed for indefinite detention of people deemed a threat to public safety, even after they'd finished their sentences.
It was a direct response to the Trynkiewicz case, and it caused a lot of debate about, where's the line between protecting society and upholding individual freedoms. Some people thought it was absolutely necessary, while others saw it as a dangerous precedent. Like it could erode basic legal principles.
So when Trynkiewicz was released in February 2014, he wasn't actually free.
No, not really. He was put under 24/7 police surveillance. They followed him everywhere, basically making him a prisoner in his own home.
Wow, I can't imagine that was cheap for the authorities, and it must have been a bizarre way to live for Trynkiewicz.
It was definitely a temporary solution while the courts figured out if they could legally keep him detained indefinitely.
And what happened?
On March 3rd, 2014, a court ordered him to be transferred to a brand new facility for dangerous offenders in Gostanen. It was officially called the Center for the Isolation of Persons with Sexual Disorders.
He was the first resident, right? And for a while, the only one, it seems like this case really pushed Poland to confront some tough questions about how to handle people who pose a serious risk to society even after they've served their time.
It definitely did. It forced them to grapple with those gray areas where public safety and individual rights clash, and there are no easy answers.
And even while he was confined to this special facility, Trynkiewicz managed to get married.
Yeah, in 2015, he married a woman who had been writing letters to him while he was in prison. It was a strange turn of events in an already unbelievable story.
It's really hard to understand what would attract someone to a man with such a dark past.
Well, this woman, we don't know her real name. She seemed to truly believe that Trynkiewicz was innocent. She even blamed his victims for what happened to them.
That's just disturbing. It's like a whole other psychological phenomenon, the way some people are drawn to dangerous individuals.
Yeah, that's a topic for a whole other deep dive, for sure, exploring what motivates those kinds of relationships.
So Trynkiewicz, he died in prison on January 9th of this year, 2025. And there wasn't much of a reaction, was there?
Not really. No public mourning, no outpouring of sympathy. It was more like a sense of relief that this dark chapter was finally over.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, a roller coaster of emotions, disbelief, outrage, and then finally a sort of numb acceptance. The Trynkiewicz case, it's a harsh reminder that evil exists in the world, and that even with our best efforts, sometimes systems fail and innocent people pay the price.
It also makes us think about how we as a society respond to these kinds of tragedies. How do we balance the need for justice with the possibility of rehabilitation? How do we protect the vulnerable while still respecting individual rights? These are tough questions, and they're questions we'll keep wrestling with.
What really struck me is how this one man's life and the way the system reacted to his crimes forced Poland to deal with these huge ethical and legal dilemmas. It shows how one case can have a ripple effect across an entire society.
Exactly, and it reminds us that we need to always be looking at our systems, learning from our mistakes, and working to build a society that's more just and more compassionate.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. I encourage everyone listening to keep digging into this case and others like it, learn about criminal psychology, explore the ins and outs of the justice system, and never be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Because the more we understand, the better chance we have of preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Until next time, keep diving deep.